Right, we ended up putting together 12 different videos of rook versus pawn and nearly 7 hours of video playing time. So nearly 7 hours of me waffling on about rook versus pawn. And is it really that important? Do we get rook versus pawn that often? It's like, well, yeah, we do. And the most common sort of ending is a rook ending, and it's also very common for rook endings to then morph into rook versus pawn. So we need to know what we're doing when we get into rook versus pawn, and the earlier we can work out what's going to be happening in that rook versus pawn situation, the better a player we're going to be, and the more half points or whole points are going to be saved. So it really is, in my view, very important to just know all the rook versus pawn stuff inside out. I can absolutely guarantee that in this 1981 game where black's about to play, the player with the black pieces absolutely knew his rook versus pawn stuff inside out, and we can demonstrate that with the moves that are about to follow. So yeah, pause the video if you want to. It's black to play. I guess you could try and assess who do you think's winning, and what's going on in the position. Material's even, sort of. Well, it is even. These two pawns are about to get swapped. So white's got this H pawn, and black's got this C pawn. And it doesn't take long of looking at the position to realise that the white rook is going to be lost for that C pawn, and this is about to become rook versus pawn. So the more we know about rook versus pawn, the better off we're going to be. We need to look at, if I play this and this, we're going to get that position. There's loads of counting it out down to that crucial crossroads position. So let's just play the most natural move that black might think to play, which is just to take the pawn. Okay, H takes G3, King takes G3, and bring the king in, King D3. Rook A2, C pawn gets pushed, H pawn gets pushed, C pawn gets pushed. The white rook's now got to go. Okay, the white rook is getting lost for that pawn, and you're just counting out the moves. Okay, I mean, you could even pause the video here. White to play. You know the crossroads position, or if you don't, go and watch the rook versus pawn videos. You know all the techniques, all the things we should be thinking about. Is this a win for black, or is this a draw? I think, well, I've counted it out, and looks like black's won this to me. So just count out the moves. King G4, and let's just have a look. There it is. Black to play as a win, white to play as a draw, and it is black to play. So black's won. So back to the original position. Yeah, black should just take on G3. Okay. You sure? You sure you looked at all the moves you should have been looking at? White to play. What should white play here? Shouldering. King F4. Okay. Pretty much covered this exact sort of position. I definitely covered this or something incredibly similar in the rook versus pawn shouldering video. And the point is that now, in the counting out the moves down to that crucial crossroads position, black has to waste a move putting their rook on H1, which they never needed to do in the other variation. There we are. Black to play as a win, white to play as a draw. It is white to play, and it is a draw. Okay. Crucially, my advice is always push the king, but when it's a rook's pawn, you have to push the king. One of the positions we looked at, I think it was in rook versus pawn mixed bag, the player, I think it was down this end of the board, and they pushed the H pawn instead of the king to G2, but it doesn't really matter. It's the same idea. Someone who played some previous moves very well then stupidly pushed the H pawn. Always push the king. You have to push the king here for the rook's pawn. So back in this position, king f4 draws. And that means that the player with the black pieces in this position worked all of that out from here. Okay? They worked out that if I play h takes g3, we'll get this. The rook has to go for the pawn. White will then play this shouldering move, and then they counted it all out to here and said, oh well, that's just a draw. So I'm not going to take on g3. I'm going to try and find something else. There you go. That's a level of chess that's possible. That's a level of chess I'm going to try and reach personally. Otherwise, what's the point in trying unless we're going to try and do something to better ourselves as players? And for me, that's exactly the sort of thing that would make me a better player if I can achieve. I'm in a rook ending, and I've got to try and work out if I do this, blah blah blah, and it'll all end up in there, and I'll get that version of rook versus pawn. That's a draw, or that's a win. And if h takes g3, then blah, 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 that's a draw. That shouldering move, that was very, very annoying. Let's look at some other moves. King d3, well, doesn't really get very far. Rook g2. You can see that's not going to do black any favours. We can even now take back the g-pawn with the rook, so our king's already one move further on to supporting the h-pawn in its fight against this rook. You just got to be careful there not to let black interfere with your rook, so that you end up playing against a queen. You just got to be a bit careful of that. But white's got no problems there as long as they are careful of that interference. So in this position, if we take on g3, there's a problem, and the problem is here. White plays this shouldering move, crucial shouldering move. We've seen how that was absolutely crucial in gaining that one tempo that was needed. So black worked all of that out and played this. Wow. Rook f1 check. Just cut the king off. They've already worked out the rook versus pawn that's coming. And they played rook f1 check. Cut off the white king. Then take the g-pawn. And now white realised they were in trouble. If king takes g3, king d3, we see all the same stuff. But the white king can't come to f4. And I could go through the moves again, but just count it out. We're going to end up in that position with black to move. Okay. And white was also a very strong player, and realised that. So started. I mean, at this stage, there's not really a lot going on, but excuse me. Rook d2 check was tried, and black played king e3. White played rook g2. And then black transferred their rook to the fourth rank. Again, more knowledge of rook versus pawn. Okay, I'll come back to that, what was happening in the game in a minute. I'm absolutely positive that both players had really good knowledge of the rook versus pawn that was coming up. It's just this is the position they both ended up in. If white tries rook c2, black can still just transfer their rook to the fourth rank. It doesn't really change anything. Okay. Let's go back to the game, because you might be wondering how does it finish off from here? Well, it's going to be the same as the game, basically. The same idea. We're going to get a compartmentalization. C-pawn gets pushed, H-pawn gets pushed, rook comes behind the C-pawn. Rook c2, because we want to try and force the black king at least to come away from, to become a knight. To come away from the action. That's the best chance we've got. But the problem we've got here is that black plays king d3. The problem you've got as white is that this rook has cut off the white king on the third rank, and that means that rook deals with the h-pawn by itself. Independently of that, this king and this pawn are going to be winning this rook. There's no way for white to combine the compartments, and the game finished. Like this. King takes c1. Crucial. Only winning move, in fact. Usually this move will be a disaster. In most rook versus pawn situations where you're just about to enter it, you know, there are positions where the actual winning maneuver is to make sure that you take with a rook rather than the king, so your king is one crucial tempo closer to where it needs to be, getting back down to that crossroads position. But here we don't need the king. The rook is dealing, because of the cut off, the rook is dealing with the pawn by itself. So how about that? My aim, personally, if I'm going to get any good at all, after all this work I'm doing on endgames, is precisely this sort of thing. Like, I want to get enough knowledge in my head of all the different positions that might be about to happen in a minute that makes me good enough to judge the moves I have to play now, to be able to work out. That doesn't lead to a win, because in 4 or 5 moves time, White's going to play King F4, that one crucial tempo gain from shouldering. So I'm not going to do that. But if King F4 is so annoying, in a minute, why don't I cut off the king from the F file now? Right, next. This is a game from 1967. It's black to play. Pause the video and ask yourself, what's white threatening? And what am I going to do about it? And by the way, something that occurred to me, which is sort of mildly amusing on that, he's like, oh yeah, but if I was playing a game of chess, I wouldn't know that now I've got to think, right, what's my opponent's threat and what am I going to do about it? I wouldn't know that if I was playing a game of chess. And I'd be like, well, you kind of would. That is actually one of the things that if we all did every single move, we would all become better chess players. You know, the reason we don't do it religiously is because a lot of the time our opponent isn't threatening anything. You know, they're just taking back a piece or something, a move that has to be played, or they're just castling because it's move 5 and they're getting their king in the corner. But if we did sort of go through religiously, it's a bit like the checks, captures, attacks checklist. Every time you play a move, you know, if we did that, we would all just never blunder. I think the top players must just do it, and they do it subconsciously, and when they make blunders, they go back to doing it consciously. But anyway, pause the video. I've been waffling on for long enough now. Hopefully you've already paused the video. What's White's main threat? And what am I going to do about it? 2 pretty good questions to ask yourself at any stage in a game of chess. Well, interference is one of the things that's going to be going on. It's one of the main themes here. If you've got a rook ending and a pawn that's 1 square away from promotion, interference should be massively on your radar. Okay, because this rook is the only thing stopping that pawn becoming a queen. So any clever little tactic that drags the rook that way, and we're going to see lots of different examples now, and we'll get the queen. Okay, so what White's threatening here is king b5, that attacks the rook, which has to disappear back on the a file, and then we will play rook c6 check and interfere with the rook's covering of the a8 square. So what could black do to deal with that? Well, king h5 seems like a fairly natural move. You want to get your king up the board anyway. We are in the middle of a position where clearly this rook's going to be lost for this pawn, and we're going to end up in rook versus pawn. So why not play king h5? Let's see how that works out. White would play king b6 because they're looking to play rook c8 and promote the a pawn. Excuse me. So what are black's choices here? Well, the first thing is you might think of doing a check, rook b4, check, but that's a very bad idea because white can play king a5, and when the rook comes back, we go rook c4, and we're going to be interfering over here. Okay, so that's an immediate win for white. Engine saying checkmate in 13, in fact. What else? We might think to push the g-pawn. That's a move we want to play anyway in the up-and-coming rook versus pawn. But careful, and this happens quite a lot in rook endings, I find. You sort of, especially the ones that are about to transition to rook versus pawn, you sort of get ahead of yourself and say, oh, okay, right, rook versus pawn, I'll start pushing the pawn. It's just like, well, hang on a minute. I think you've just let it become a queen versus pawn. Oops. Okay, so we can't push the g-pawn. Similarly, all right, I'll play king h4. Same problem. Okay, we've got rook c4 check straight away. That's not actually a good idea, by the way. I'll explain why. So rook c4 check straight away. Rook takes c4. You think, right, you get the queen. This is actually a theoretical draw. And practically reasonably defendable as well. So yeah, you don't want to do that. But king h4 is still a blunder because white can play king b5. Okay, and when the rook disappears on the a file, check and rook a4. So it's almost like everything black's trying here, by the way, against king b6 is going to be met with this interference idea. And finally, if rook a1, just trying to get a bit of space, the white rook just goes to c8, and you've got no choice then but to take the a pawn. Okay. And if you decided on your first move being king h5, and after king b6 I'll play rook a1, I mean, you know, we should have seen this far, taking on a7, and now we've got to count out the moves down to that crucial crossroads position. We've got the added feature of it being a knight's pawn, which might mean at some stage it doesn't, but you know, one thing we should think about is what if the white rook came to f8 and just cut the king off onto the edge of the board. That might be a feature. In fact, that's irrelevant here. We can just literally count out the moves and see that this is lost for black, whatever happens. Black's got a choice. They can either just do the straight run for it, and that's very easy to count out just in time, and black's lost. I suppose we might see king h1. If I was black there, I'd play king h1 and hope that white doesn't play rook h8 checkmate. Hope they take the pawn instead. That'll be my last try. So yeah, the straight running for it doesn't work. And if black sort of goes in front of the pawn, which is a disadvantage because you lose a move being in front of your own pawn, but an advantage because at least you're going to end up here shouldering away the white king, then we're going to see king b6, king f3. It would be a draw if white doesn't deliver the time-gaining check. Okay, so that time-gaining check and the race to this crucial crossroads position, white to play as a win, it is white to play, had to be in all those calculations back here. Okay? And the player playing with the black pieces didn't deal with this threat by playing king h5. King h5 is a very natural move to play here. Okay. But they saw all of that and didn't play it because they just saw king b6 and all those variations, including, you know, the ones we just saw with the time gaining check and all the rest of it. That's a lot of calculation, and in my view must have been a lot of knowledge to cut those calculations short to work out king h5 is lost. But they were also aware, when I say this was actually, they were also aware. The player with the black pieces here was actually Dvoretsky himself, so no wonder he was aware, because it's his book I'm going through. They're also aware of another technique. Okay, I mean, we're about to end up in rook versus pawn, sure. And what we're trying to do as a principle as black is make sure this white king is as far away from the action as possible. Okay, so rook a1 was played. Black plays king b6. The aim there is to make contact with the a7 pawn so that we can play rook c8 and defend the a8 equals queen. Now, when the rook was on a4, this rook b4 check didn't do anything because the king a5 hit the rook, and then we saw the rook c4 come down. Whereas here, there's much more space to fire in all the checks. White's going to get nowhere coming down for the rook, obviously. So white has to tuck their king behind the rook and then to b8. Okay. But now the white king's miles away, and we don't have to go to h5 and step in front of our own pawn. King f5, draw. Really, really handy to know about that technique. Thinking in advance. Rook versus pawn's coming. I don't want the white king anywhere near my king and pawn. I do not want the white king getting to this square with white to move. I'll come back to a1 and I will just check the white king until next week. Next, white to play. This game's from 1981. So, what's that, 14 years after the last one. That last one was played very well by the player with the black pieces. What should white do now? Pause the video. Should be an easy one. So in the game, white has only one drawing move here, but in the game they didn't play it. They played f5, and it's now lost. Okay, the black king is already in contact with the b pawn, so rook d1 was played. That pawn now has to be taken. Really, there's no point taking it on the next go with the, this doesn't really get the rook further away from where it needs to be. Whereas at least rook takes b2 does get the king further away from where it needs to be. King g6, and then the black king just starts to come back. This is how the game actually went. You can see the black king's now back. This is not looking good, is it? h6, rook a1, and it finished like this. White resigned there. They didn't even bother knighting and then losing their knight, or queening and allowing a checkmate in one. Similar to that would be king g6. Black still just plays rook d1, get the king away, and we take the h-pawn straight away this time. King back to g6, king d4, push the h-pawn. I mean, it's a good idea to push the h-pawn instead of the f-pawn, because whilst the e5 square is covered, but black just still is going to get their they're going to get their king back. If h6, we're going to be pushing the white king off the board that way. I mean, we might see f5 check. You can see it's just gone. Or if f5, it's going to be very similar. King d6 anyway. We probably just transposed, to be honest. In fact, I'm sure we have just transposed there. Rook g1 check, king h6, and then king f7. And the presence of the f5 pawn doesn't actually change anything. We might see a knight, king f6. And I suppose the knight's not lost immediately because the g6 is defending. The f5 pawn's defending g6, but rook h1, obviously. Is rook h1 the only winning move? It is, actually. I mean, it's checkmating too, but it's a pretty obvious only winning move, but it is the only winning move. So yeah, it doesn't work. Just sort of going into it's not quite rook versus pawn because we've got two pawns over here against one, but it is going to be two pawns and against rook, and really this pawn doesn't stand a chance of surviving. Although white does sort of have to lose time taking it. If you just go straight into it, you've lost. You had to use instead the idea. The player with the white piece at the time had to use instead the same idea we saw in the previous game, where we've got to get this black king before we actually get into the rook versus pawn. We know we're about to transition into it. We've got to get that king out the way. So we should just check. Just check it till next week. Okay, come back, attack the b pawn. The only way that black can make progress is to let their king come down to c1. But then we can just get on with it. f5, queen. Look how far away the black king is here in comparison to the other position. King g6, and we can easily just nab this, come back, push the h-pawn, Black doesn't stand a chance of getting their king to e6 with black to play by the time we've done that. What's that? It's only got 3 moves for us, isn't it? They've also got to sort this out. Draw. Yeah. So that was an idea that should have featured there and did feature here. Rook a1. We're going to check the king up there, get it right out the way. And in this game, it should have featured. We're going to check the king all the way down to c1, get it out the way. It has to start the rook versus pawn race on b1. Next, this is a game from 1925. It's white to play. See if you can work out a move that's better than white's next move. What would you do here? And I've got to confess, the only reason that I would have played a different move to white's next move is because this position was in a book with white to play. If this had been a position in front of me on a chessboard with white to play, I could well have made the same next move as it was actually Tarrasch playing white, which was resigns. He just resigned, which has gone into the tragicomedy section of Dvoretsky. But you can see why he's resigned. Like, this rook is about to get lost for this pawn, and independently of that, this rook has cut off our king, and he's going to win our h-pawn by itself. And every time we've seen a version of this, I've talked about compartmentalizing it. You know, as independently of that, the only way that what I just said can be sort of wrong is if it's not independently of that. And this happens in chess a lot, actually. You should always be on the lookout for it. This is one of the reasons chess is such a rich game and why we all love it. You've got that going on in that bit of the board where, I don't know, the knight's about to deal with that pawn or whatever, and over here, independently of that, the king's safe from the attack from that bishop or whatever. And it's like, actually, if I move my knight here or whatever, you combine the two compartments. How are you going to combine these compartments? So it's like, and we're going to use interference. There's an interference thing that's going to save, or should have saved, the player with the white piece. This game's 100 years old, so 100 years after Tarrasch resigned. I could see myself resigning that as well, and I probably would have played a few more moves. Excuse me. Maybe I would have played h6. Because this is the bit where black's like, okay, yep, I'm coming for that pawn. That's that one compartment. Remember, you're still going to need your rook to. I should really learn how to use my mouse properly. You're going to need your rook to sack for that pawn. I don't know what you're doing here. I'd be like, right, well, maybe that combines the compartments. It's like, all right, good luck with that. A2. Oh dear, now I need to put my rook back to a5. Oh, it's all gone bad. But you might have seen it. I mean, I probably would by this stage. The fact it was in a book made me sort of search for it. h7. Black's like, all right. Rook b8. I'll just take that. Fair enough. You're going to get rook versus queen. We'll see h8 equals queen. Rook takes h8. Rook takes h8. a1 equals queen, and queen versus rook. Good luck. Bosh. Wow. I've already said once in this video, whenever you have a pawn one rank from the... Why did it have to be green and red? Whenever you have a pawn one rank from being promoted, so a pawn that's about to promote, interference is something that should be massively on your radar. Even knowing that, by the way, interference is something I sort of am aware of in rook endings. I still couldn't see it, and neither could Tarash, and hence he resigned. I mean, I'm absolutely positive that if you gave Tarash that position and said, "What do you think White can do here?" you would look at it and you go, right, well, h8 equals queen, rook takes a1 equals queen. Can I be bothered to defend queen versus rook today? Up to you. What else have we got? Because it's looking pretty desperate. I mean, you'd find rook b5 check. Most people would find rook b5 check in that position, surely. They would, wouldn't they? Because it's one that you've got nothing else. So you might as well look for that. But we needed to see it back here as a way of combining those two compartments, so that black can't just promote this to win this rook. So I'm laughing at my own colour scheme madness. And independently of that, I'm still at it. Win your h-pawn with their rook. Right, next. This is actually a game from 1977. It's black to play. We can see that this pawn very much is the stronger passed pawn and is probably about to win the white rook. But then we're going to maybe end up in rook versus pawn. Alright, the white king's a long way away for now. So what does black do here? And pause the video, see if you can work out a way for black to win this, because black's clearly got an advantage. So if you just sort of politely proceed with g3, rook g6, g2, king b3, rook f4, and what we're trying to do here is cut off the white king, and independently of that, win the rook with our g pawn. There's not actually enough time to do it here. Okay, we can't create those independent compartments here because white can now push the a pawn now whilst their rook's still on the board. Okay, you think, well, that was a bit stupid, wasn't it? Because we can now interfere. And white's like, I don't care if you interfere. I'm going to get a queen. And that would be a draw. So that's a bit annoying. So back in this position, rook f4, that doesn't work. If you just go for the sort of race, it's just going to get nowhere. We can see that the white king, which did start on b2, is easily going to get to here with the pawn on a6 way before this black king can get back from g1 to d6. So that's not going to work. And if we go back to the original position, it was a bit annoying letting the rook behind that pawn. If the rook comes behind the pawn, the king can come and help the b pawn. It's not good, basically. So what do? Well, this king and this pawn, they're in a very strong place. So you've just got to make sure this rook doesn't get out from being stuck in front of its own pawn. That's the trick. And in the game, the player played it very well. Rook f5. Okay. In the game, rook a8 was played. I mean, possibly a different try is king b3. We'd see g3, king b4, g2, and when the rook comes behind the pawn, now the interference works, because that white pawn is nowhere near queening. So it didn't help white, to try and get their king to the b pawn as quickly as possible to release the rook. If the rook, by the way, moves away from the a pawn, we just take it, and that's clearly won. We're gonna get Lucena at the very least there. We're gonna get a vertical cutoff on at least the e file, possibly even the d file. So what does white do? Well, they move their rook out the way, because at least then their a pawn's got sort of some room to breathe. The g pawn got pushed, the a pawn got pushed. Don't let the rook out. Rook f6. a7. Don't let the rook out. Rook f7. White resigned. It's just so simple when you see it. It was don't let the rook out, don't let the rook out, and don't let the rook out. That was it, and white resigned. Very neat. This one, good luck. That's all I can say with this one. Good luck trying to work out what to do here. I mean, pause the video if you want. I suppose you need to know which side it is to play, don't you? White to play. Wow.